especially over this past decade, is China, Russia, Iran, North Korea banding together. And many people have said that this is a new coalition that is in opposition, not just to the United States, not just to the West, but to the rest of the world. And we're going to start close to home with Joseph Humeyer. Joseph, in Venezuela, we know that Cuba has continually supported the regime there, but it seems that one of the members of this axis has also been very much involved.
Yes, well, thanks, Gordon. Thanks for having me. Great to be at CPAC, first of all. Venezuela has become, so if you read the National Security Strategy of the United States that's published every year by the White House, what you see is you have something called GPC, the era of great power competition. That means we're not just fighting transnational threats like terrorism or organized crime, we're also fighting big state actors that work with these threats, Russia, China, and Iran. And so what Venezuela has become the greatest challenge to the United States in this era of great power competition. You have all those actors. You have Russia, you have Iran, you have China, you have North Korea, you have Turkey. They're all in Venezuela. And what they are doing is they're destabilizing the country of Venezuela, much like they destabilized the country of Syria, so that they can use asymmetric weapons of war. Migration has become a weapon of war. Narcotic trafficking has become a weapon of war. They've used other elements that aren't traditional to be able to destabilize the region in order to delegitimize the United States.
And so Iran has been involved in Venezuela as well?
Yeah, so let me I'm going to tell you something that's a little bit of breaking news here. I follow Iran very closely. In fact, I published a book in 2014 called Iran's Strategic Penetration of Latin America. The reason I use strategic penetration is because they use covert methods to come in. But let me tell you something. There was a flight that went from 2007 to 2012. It was called Aeroterror by the Brazilian intelligence because it was known to shuttle terrorists from Iran and Syria into Venezuela. It was a bi-weekly national flight that went from Venezuela to Iran. And trust me, there is no tourism between those two countries. So it wasn't tourists that were on these flights. There were terrorists. That flight stopped in 2012, and it just began 2 weeks ago, again. That same flight is an Airbus 340 that landed in Venezuela 2 weeks ago and went to Uruguay, Nicaragua, Panama, and Venezuela. It's a Venezuelan national airline, but the pilots are Iranian. So that just to show you the level of trust that these countries have with one another.
Ariel Davis, we just heard about Iran in our region, but Iran, of course, is a major actor in the Persian Gulf and Middle East, and is perhaps, I'm sure, the main threat to Israel as well.
It is. What I think makes Iran particularly interesting is that during the Obama years, we were sort of sold this false narrative when it came to Iran. We were told that when dealing with Iran, we either have all-out war or the alternative is appeasement. And that's where the Iran deal came in. And that's where you saw this narrative or this false binary being sold within the Iran echo chamber. What makes the Trump years sort of interesting, and in my what I would say my opinion, is that now we see there's an alternative. There's a third path, and it's called maximum pressure. And that has been sort of the thrust of Pompeo's plan when it comes to dealing with Iran. And it really goes to show that Iran will back down if we show a little bit of force. And I think that's important because, again, when it came to the Obama years, we were told that the only option we had was to appease the mullahs. The only way we could do that was by lifting sanctions. And so I think now more than ever, what is a positive turnaround with the Trump administration is we're seeing a realignment of the Middle East. And you mentioned Israel. What's really interesting now is that Israel is finding it has a number of allies within the Middle East who actually genuinely fear the rise of the Iranian regime and the exportation of the quote-unquote revolution.
So when we talk about Iran, many of us talk about the nuke deal as you just did. And just quickly, how far along is Iran, or how soon can they develop a usable nuclear device?
I mean, there's a lot of educated guesses, 5, 10 years. What I think will be a key player in the next 6 months is whether or not the Trump administration decides to invoke the snapback. There's a provision in UN Security Council Resolution 2231, which is the counterpart to the Iran deal, that essentially says if any JCPOA participant state decides to invoke the snapback, it means all of the sanctions that had previously been terminated under the Iran deal will be snapped back into place. What does that mean? It means that all the sanctions that had essentially been lifted by the Iran deal and are essentially set to sunset in the next couple years will be put back into place. Iran should be terrified of this for obvious reasons, because it means that not only are we going to be continuing our sanction regime, but it means all others on the UN Security Council will also have to put sanctions on Iran. That means Russia, that means China, that means all of Iran's tepid allies. So this, I think, is something that we should be very intrigued by in the next 6 months. It's something to watch for. The State Department has put us on alert about it, so we should be aware that that could be coming down the pipeline. It hasn't gotten much attention because when it was snuck into the Iran deal in 2015, no one ever suspected that a US president would use it. Legally, it's feasible. Diplomatically, it's an entirely different question.
When we talk about Iran, we talk about nukes, we talk about sanctions and snapbacks, we have to also consider that a major contributor to the Iranian nuclear program is North Korea. Kim Kwon-dong, what do you think right now about the pressure that the United States and the international community is applying to the Kim regime in the north?
북한의 핵 개발에 따른 그 국제사회의 제재는 북한과의 협상이나 혹은 그 김정은 체제나 김정은 정책의 변화로 이루어질 수 없는 것입니다.
These sanctions, international sanctions, as to the North Korean nuclear development, cannot really actually be really helpful in terms of deterring in terms of the negotiations that is being held with North Korea and Jang Kim.
왜냐하면 그것은 근본적으로 중국의 핵 전략이기 때문에 그렇습니다.
Because fundamentally it is China's PRC's nuclear strategy. That's the reason why.
중국이 북한의 핵 전략을 도와주면서 북한을 내세워서 한국에 대한 압박을 가하고 있는 상황입니다.
So China is actually the actor that's behind all these pressures, and they are applying this pressure, having North Korea as the front tier, and hiding behind North Korea. And China is the actor who's applying all these pressures now.
Ariel, we just heard about pressure on North Korea, perhaps not working like we would like it to. What is your assessment of American pressure and European pressure on the Iranian regime when it comes to their nuke program?
I think under the Trump administration, like I said earlier, I think the maximum pressure campaign could be even stronger than it is right now. We are still giving sanction waivers to various countries, especially in Europe. The Europeans have been very lukewarm when it comes to dealing with Iran for a host of reasons, mostly economic, because there's a ton of integration with European and Iranian trade. But in general, I think the Europeans are very nervous about how the Trump administration is going to behave in the next 6 months, especially with regards to the snapback provision in 2231. There isn't, again, I should go into a little bit more detail, but the snapback is odd because it's something you usually only see in international trade agreements. It's a very, very novel component to have in a political agreement of this nature or a disarmament agreement of this nature. And so I think what must be going through the Europeans' minds right now is sort of trying to hedge their bets a bit and see where they're sort of going to react based on how the Trump administration reacts. Right now they're continuing to conduct business with Iran. I'm not sure if they have a plan for what to do should they have to slap sanctions back on Iran. If they do, it could very well be a crisis of legitimacy for the UN in some way, or the UN Security Council in particular.
Okay, we will open this up to questions in just a moment, but before we do, Joseph, Ariel talked about pressure on the Iranian regime. Pressure can be in the form of sanctions, as Ariel has been talking about. It can also be in the killing of terrorist regime figures, like General Soleimani. Where do you see the blowback, if it's coming, or maybe it's not coming, but where do you see it?
Okay, so first of all, let me just say that I have to say I have to commend President Trump for doing one of the most strategic moves in the Middle East that has been done in the last 20 years. By killing General Qasem Soleimani, he didn't even just He didn't just kill one general. He literally destabilized the entire infrastructure of a terror regime that had been exported throughout the world. You had allies of Iran, from Venezuela to Russia, completely in shock that they never saw this coming. Soleimani didn't see this coming. He was riding with a convoy of about 10 vehicles. I mean, they called him a shadowy commander, but he wasn't in the shadow. He was taking selfies in Syria, so that wasn't in the shadows. Let me say what's the blowback. Okay, so here's one of the legacies of Qasem Soleimani. Isn't just the IEDs in Iraq. It also isn't just the terror sponsoring throughout the Middle East and the world. It is also the civil war in Yemen. It is also the civil war in Syria. It is also the conflict in Venezuela. The idea of using conflicts as a way to destabilize is something that Soleimani understood, because they use networks, non-state networks, armed non-state actors. They make cohesive networks. It was Soleimani who brought the idea of using drug trafficking and terrorists and converging them together, something that analysts said would never happen, because some are motivated by God and others are motivated by greed. But what we found out is when it comes to logistical networks, they work together. So the blowback I think is going to happen is more conflicts in the Middle East, and those conflicts being exported to other parts of the world, such as Latin America.
Your answer, Joseph, sort of sparked a question I have for Mr. Kim, and that is, did Kim Jong-un, when he heard about the killing of General Soleimani, what was going through his mind at that moment? Is that going to affect his behavior, or does he think that he's just immune?
중국의 공산당 커뮤니스트 파티는 70년간 유지됐습니다. 마찬가지로 북한의 커뮤니스트 파티도 70년간 유지되고 있습니다.
The Communist Party in China has maintained its power for about 70 years, likewise in North Korea.
북한의 김정은 체제라고 하는 것은 봉건주의적 세습 체제입니다.
So the Kim Jong-un legacy in Korea, what they call legacy in Korea, is actually is something that is brought over.
feudal system.
It's a feudal system.
그렇기 때문에 김정은이 어떤 사고를 입거나 경우에 따라서 배제된다 하더라도 또 다른 토탈리테리안 딕테이터가 나타나고 그것을 백업할 수 있는 체제를 갖추고 있습니다.
So what that means is that since they have this feudal system, although Kim Jong-un might be having some accidents, or maybe he might be excluded from its regime, but since this is a totalitarian dictatorship, they have this backup system.
따라서 문제의 본질은 그 백본, feudal 시스템의 백본인 중국의 문제로부터 시작되는 것입니다.
So the issue here is to actually how to tackle the backbone, which is the feudal system that stems from China.
Questions from the audience? Anybody got a question? Over here.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. And thank you guys for today's panel. What I was wondering is, based on what Mr. Himara was saying, it's a question for the whole panel. It seems hardly unlikely that China would walk back their support for the Venezuelan regime. They have $63 billion in illegal debt that was never approved by Congress. They also are running the show on the cards, electronic cards, that are for social control, weaponization of food scarcity and medicine scarcity as well. And the third one is they're running the show on the intelligence business with the satellites and marinas, with a Russian S-300 parked in the backyard. So my question is, for the whole panel, what do you think it would take to erode these pillars of support? Not only from China, but also Russia, Iran, Cuba, and Turkey. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, that's a great question.
And you have to answer that within 1 or 2 minutes.
Okay, I will take 60 seconds to start the clock. The biggest myth about China, I'd say obviously in Latin America, but really in the world, and Gordon I think has been one of the biggest to dispel this myth, is that all they care about is economic investment. That is absolutely not true. When China was pouring billions of dollars into Venezuela, they weren't stupid. Not what every market actor was moving their money out of Venezuela, they were like, oh well, look at this great investment, we're gonna put more money in. No, what they were buying was access. Access to intelligence systems, access to territory, access to networks. And what they did for that network is they'd be able to use Venezuela as a launching pad to control the rest of the region. Let me give one quick story, let me see if I can do it in 30 seconds. In Argentina, China has a satellite space station that's run by the PLA, run by the Chinese military. That was signed by Cristina Kirchner, the former president, unfortunately now the current vice president. Mauricio Macri, the president of Argentina, when he came into presidency, he said, what the hell is this? What am I gonna do with this space station that's controlled by the Chinese military? He tried to renegotiate the agreement with China, and what Beijing told him was, yes, President Macri, you can renegotiate whatever, but please read the contract. What are you talking about, read the contract? He went back and he realized that China did something where they put a cross-default clause in every single trade investment that they did with Argentina. That means if they renegotiate the satellite, they got to renegotiate their infrastructure projects, the credits, the loans, everything. China was smart. They hoodwinked them, they tricked them, and they brought a Chinese military satellite station into their territory.
I'm going to tell the other side of the coin and say that there is some economic component to it, although that is a narrative that is just economic. But I think European countries are waking up to Chinese influence and they're trying their best, although one could argue it's a little too late. Last spring, the EU passed EU Resolution 452, which essentially created this sort of framework for dealing with foreign direct investment. Especially with regards to the Belt and Road Initiative, which had started in 2013, which was basically China's attempt to infiltrate various economies, actually 70 countries worldwide, including major actors in the EU. Looking at Brexit in particular, but not just Brexit, but sort of the move within the currents within the EU of countries departing. One major reason that countries are starting to become a little disgruntled in the EU is that they don't want to deal with this new investment framework. I'm thinking the next country to leave the EU potentially could be Italy, and part of that will be likely because they want to continue having investments from China. It's helping their economy, they like it, they're probably not thinking in the long term, which I think is a huge, huge mistake. But that's something that we should probably think about globally, about how can we help these countries whose economies might be more vulnerable to Chinese investment.
There's a question over here. My question for Ariel, if you could just expand, please, on the differences between the max pressure sanctions in the Pompeo State Department and some of the feared sanctions that would come as a part of the snapback.
Right, so basically, without boring the audience to tears, there are 6 UN Security Council resolutions that involved a host of different sanctions on Iran. And part of the Iran deal, or the 2231, which was the counterpart to the Iran deal that went through the UN, part of that was actually terminating those particular sanctions. And so 6 sanction regimes were terminated by 2231. The snapback provision essentially says if any JCPOA participant state finds Iran to be in violation of the Iran deal or of 2231, they can actually invoke the snapback and snap back into place all the sanction regimes, those 6 different UN Security Council resolutions that had previously been terminated. And in particular, there are 3 different sanctions that are set to expire or sunset very soon. In October of 2020, this year, year 5, we're going to have an arms embargo that supposedly will be lifted. So now Iran will be able to purchase weapons that they were not able to purchase previously. We also have a missile ban, I believe, was supposed to be sunsetting in year 8. And then in year 10, we're not allowed to impose sanctions on Iran theoretically at all. So invoking the snapback is critical because if we want to continue to be able to place sanctions on Iran, we actually have to invoke it.
And one of the things about sanction violations, I think the Iranians have been stiffing the international community on sanctions, and the International Atomic Energy Agency has been complicit. Dr. Kim, we just heard about sanctions on Iran. Do sanctions affect the behavior of Kim Jong-un?
No. 중국은 북한에 대한 전략적 에너지 지원을 하고 있고
Yeah, China is providing strategic, energy to North Korea.
수만 명에 대한 노동자들이 중국에 와서 일하고 그 월급을 북한으로 보내고 있게 만들고 있고.
And what they're allowing, to happening in China is that China is allowing the North Korean people to work in China, and the wages they earn, they allow the wages to be sent to North Korea. That's what they're allowing.
수많은 중국 사람들을 각 지방 성별로 조직해서 북한을 방문해서 일정 정도 돈을 현금을 도와주도록 감지하고 있습니다.
And they actually forced some of their people, China is what I'm talking about, to actually go to North Korea and provide the cash, for whatever they do in North Korea. And they're providing some sort of financial support in that regard.
We have a question over here.
I just traveled through the Panama Canal and was told that China now owns the land on either side of it. Is that true, and what are the implications?
Okay, sure, yeah. China's had control at least 50% of the Panama Canal for about 34 years now. They've increasingly been buying territory around the canals, ports and facilities, extending up to Nicaragua and down to Chile along the Pacific and Caribbean coast. China's very strategic about what they do. Let me just give you one example. The Belt and Road Initiative, everything discussed about it. In Latin America, what they've done is they've studied the region pre-Spanish colonization. So they went all the way back before the concept of a nation sovereign state really existed. And what they looked at was ecosystems, Andes, Southern Cone, Amazon, Caribbean. And they're trying to build an alternative trade infrastructure so that they can supersede the Panama Canal and push out U.S. market access. It's a long-term strategy, it's a very smart strategy, but it's only done with the complicitness of Latin American states. And that's where we have to fight. If we lose our liberty in Latin America, we lose our liberty around the world. Apparently the speaker doesn't like my answer. And that's 65% of market access for the United States.
Thank you very much for your question, because it raises a general issue, and that is, when you look at our own hemisphere, we have not paid attention to it sufficiently. And as we're hearing from these answers, we have these bad actors, Russia, China, Iran, messing around and doing all sorts of things, and indeed, and from a commercial point of view, been buying it up. There was a question there.
I say one thing just that, if that's, you can see this conflict in a place like Syria, and we're concerned, right? It was arguably one of our biggest concerns throughout the last part of the last 7-8 years. But if you see it in Venezuela, that's 1,500 miles from Florida. That's very concerning. And you see numbers of refugees increasing above 5.5 million, and by this time next year, we'll probably supersede the Syrian refugee crisis. That's untenable for the United States.
And that's pressing up on our southern border. Question over here.
Chinese government acting like a monolith on all these actions? There's no pushback?
The question is China inside? Is everyone on board with these types of policies? Okay, I'll quickly deal with that. Inside China, there is always conflict at the top of the Communist Party, because that's the nature of the regime. But right now, you have a leader, Xi Jinping, who has been able to dominate the political landscape, and he's been able to do it quite effectively. The issue going forward, though, is that a lot of people in Beijing don't like the idea of the Belt and Road, which is Xi Jinping's initiative to build transportation links to connect China with the rest of the world, because it's been uneconomic, and whatever benefits China gets, in most cases, has been outweighed by other factors. So as Xi Jinping has more and more opponents, and he's having more opponents because his policies aren't working, I think you will find that Beijing will not be the monolith that it was 3-4 years ago. Question over here.
Gordon, last year you chaired a breakout session where we had the Armed Services Committee, Congressman President. We spoke about the military response and the congressional sensitivity to what's going on here. What's the current state of affairs with regard to either the State Department or Armed Services or the military to counter some of these things? Hopefully we're not asleep at the wheel through your efforts amongst others, but what's going on in that regard?
Anybody in the panel want to handle?
I'd say from where I look at, I think one of the better outlooks on this is actually coming from U.S. Southern Command. U.S. Southern Command, I don't know, about 5 or 6 years ago, they discarded the compartmentalization of threats. They used to have, inside Florida, inside Southern Command, they used to have analysts that would look at transnational organized crime, other analysts that would look at terrorists, other analysts that would look at proliferators. And what they realized is that there's a convergence happening among all these threats. National Defense University has written already 2 books about this word convergence. And what they did is they adapted their analytical community to create divisions that look at trans-regional threat networks. Networks that exist all the way in the Middle East, Africa, Asia, that move products, illicit products, weapons, strategic materials, minerals, from one side of the world to the other side of the world in a matter of hours. And how to follow these chains and how it affects U.S. national security all the way up into, including within our territory and on our border. And I think that is the right outlook. We have to look at this as networks as opposed to just compartmentalized functions.
Last year, we talked about the 2017 National Security Strategy of President Trump, which, unlike other national security strategies, this one is a landmark document. Since that time, we had Vice President Pence give his October speech on China, and also Secretary of State Pompeo had an October speech on China. And when you put the comments of the Vice President and the Secretary of State together, you're starting to get something which looks like George Kennan's 1946 long telegram and his 1947 Article X on the Soviet Union, which was paradigm shifting in many ways. So you're starting to see that in the Trump administration. And also there's a certain amount of support for that among establishment Democrats. For instance, Speaker Pelosi, Minority Leader Schumer are very much on board with what the Trump administration has been doing to lead the way. Mr. Kim, on a number of these issues in terms of American policy towards North Korea, we have seen President Trump take up this issue, whereas his predecessors have generally let it stay in the background. What is your quick assessment of President Trump's strategy and how Kim Jong-un is reacting to it?
북한의 전략이라고 하는 것은 기본적으로 중국의 지시를 받고 이행하는 것입니다.
Basically, if you're talking about the strategy of North Korea, is to get the support from China. Basically, that's their strategy.
북한과의 협상을 통해서 양보를 하면은 북한이 변할 수 있다라고 믿는 것은 그것은 바로 중국이 원하는 것입니다.
So when, in terms of engaging in negotiations with North Korea, if you expect that they will yield in their position, it's actually and change their position in that regard, is actually what China wants.
지금까지 6번의 핵실험을 했고 수많은 도발을 했지만 그것을 막기 위해서 오히려 한미 간의 동맹을 약화시키고 군사훈련을 축소하는 정책을 펼쳐왔습니다.
Although there were 6 nuclear tests so far, and actually there were a lot of provocations that happened, and although there were efforts that were made to prevent that from happening, so as a result, in an event, it ended up actually weakening the alliance between US and Korea, and that also had some negative impact.
군사동맹을 약화시키고 군사훈련을 축소시키는 것은 그대로 북한과 중국이 원하는 것을 해주고 있는 것입니다.
So by weakening this alliance between U.S. and Korea, and also by actually reducing the military exercises efforts that are happening between the countries, is actually what China wanted, and actually what North Korea wanted.
I saw a question over here. Yes.
Thank you. My question is, I wanted to ask this question in the former session presentation of China. My understanding is China has its own internal or intrinsic issues like democratic issues, economic decline, or huge debt, or criticism from inside and outside. So what do you think if China reaches the point we should recognize?
Oh boy, I love that question. The weakest point is this political system, and we've seen this with the coronavirus episode, where for 6 weeks the political system allowed a highly transmissible disease to ravage China, and the Chinese people didn't have any protection. And after that, they decided to go back to even more control over information. So we are seeing a run-of-the-mill virus become a full-blown epidemic in China, and maybe a pandemic around the world because of the failure of the Chinese political system. So it's political system that is the weakest.
I want to add to that and say political apathy as well. I think there is a sense in which people are sort of resigned to the structure of the government. You can look at the fact that global poverty has dropped by half in the last 40 years, and almost exclusively in China and India. And it's because of that, I would say, economic bump, that people sometimes become politically apathetic. It's the same thing that happened in the Soviet Union after Putin came to power in 1999 to 2000. There was a big bump, there was a big rise in oil prices after Yeltsin exited, and people started to associate economic progress with the Putin regime, which is something that sort of started to breed this political complacency. And I think that's also a similar issue in communist China.
This whole issue of apathy is absolutely fascinating. Joseph, are the Iranian people apathetic?
No, absolutely not. They've shown this time and time again. They've been protesting since 2009, obviously going back to 1999. The students have protested time and time again. But the Iranians realize that they can't do this by themselves. They need support, and I think they rely on the United States, great powers that can deal with the great powers that are oppressing them inside Iran.
Dr. Kim, are the people in North Korea apathetic?
I think so.
I love your short answers. Okay, there's a question right here. This woman, right back there, staring at her cell phone, which means we're going to get a really good question.
With Chinese influence behind North Korea, what do you think of Trump's visit to India recently? And can we expect the conservatives to win the election in South Korea in April?
Wow, okay. The conservatives in South Korea are right now not united, and that is a real concern. With the outbreak of the coronavirus in South Korea, which I think is largely due to horrible political decisions that Moon Jae-in made, there is a movement now to postpone those April 15th elections. Those are elections for the National Assembly, which is a unicameral legislature. All 300 seats are up for grabs. This is where South Korea really, I think, makes critical decisions. Dr. Kim.
Yeah, extreme socialist Moon Jae-in government could not sustain.
Yeah, the government, Moon Jae-in government, the extreme socialists, they cannot be sustained. They cannot sustain.
Because 한국 국민들은 이미 3년간의 소셜리스트 정부가 한 것을 알고 있고 평가하기 때문에 더 이상 지지를 계속하지 않을 것입니다.
I don't believe the Korean people will support the government, the socialist government, because they know what they have done during the last 3 years. They're fully aware of that.
더구나 이번에 그 코로나 바이러스의 영향은 그 좌파 정부가 과연 효율적인 그 정부의 행정 능력을 가지고 있느냐에 대한 커다란 실망을 안겨주었기 때문에 4월 15일 날 제너럴 일렉션은 컨서버티브가 이길 것이라고 판단합니다.
And because of this coronavirus events that occurred in Korea, and they demonstrated how ineffective they are as a government, not to be able to handle the issue efficiently. So I am sure that at the general election in April 15, the conservatives will definitely win the election.
There's a question right back there.
Do you have any information on the amount of the Chinese students that were coming over and they were supposedly involved in basically espionage of our universities across the country? I heard something in the news a few weeks ago saying that there was a pullback on some of their green cards, or they were restricting the amount of Chinese students that could come into our universities. You know anything about that?
Yeah, the Trump administration, because of the problems that you talk about in terms of the theft of information in universities, has severely cut back on visas for Chinese students. That's only a stopgap measure. This is one of the most complex issues that the U.S. faces because there are no good answers here. But obviously we've got to do something because otherwise all the information in the U.S. is going to be sucked into China, and we absolutely cannot allow that to happen. So while we try to figure out some solutions to these issues, there will be, and there should be, a reduction in the number of students, Chinese students in our country. And I say that being the son of someone who came over from China and studied in New York State. Question over here. No? Did you see that? Okay, over here.
Okay, thank you. previous panel, it was discussed about the run of gold out of Venezuela to some of the modern Axis states. I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit more and what the intent that those states had for that gold.
Oh, that Joseph, that has that question, your name written all over it.
So gold is the second largest commodity out of Venezuela, obviously the first being oil. It has, some people estimate, one of the fourth or fifth largest gold reserves in the world. And because the government, the state as itself doesn't function at all, the gold mines and the gold area of Venezuela is in the hands of terrorists. Essentially, it's in the hands of the ELN of Colombia, hands of the FARC of Colombia, Hezbollah from Lebanon. Pretty much everyone that wants to get access to gold to use it for either illicit mining, for money laundering, or for other purposes have done it. But here's the thing about the gold mines in Venezuela. Underneath the gold mines in Venezuela is uranium. And next to the gold mines in Venezuela is thorium. Two strategic minerals that have become a part of a global procurement and acquisition network that runs all throughout Latin America to the benefit of countries that are looking for those minerals. Countries such as Iran, such as Russia. So Venezuela has become a black box of minerals that we don't know what's coming in and out of that country, but we know that it most likely is going to nefarious causes. So that's a bit of the concern with the gold mines in Venezuela.
I want to close up by asking each of the panelists a question. So, Dr. Kim, a year from now, let's say that President Trump is reelected. Is there going to be a change in Trump administration policy with regard to North Korea? And what is Kim Jong-un going to do? Quickly, please.
북한의 김정은을 체제를 바꾸고 그 핵을 포기시키기 위해서는 중국에 대한 점진적인, 가중적인 서스테인먼트, 컨테인먼트 폴리시가 필요하고 그것을 보다 세컨더리 보이콧을 확대하는 정책이 필요할 것이라고 생각합니다.
So that Jong-un Kim will would be willing to change its regime and give up on their nuclear program. I believe there should be a gradual containment policy that needs to be exercised by the U.S. government, and actually that would actually bring about the change that we need to see.
Joseph, a year from now, we started in Venezuela, let's, with you end in Venezuela. A year from now, are we going to see as much Chinese and Russian influence in Caracas?
Well, we're going to see more. What we seen a year ago was everyone was talking about Cuba. Today, everyone's talking about Russia. Next year, everyone's going to talk about Iran and China. And what we're going to realize is that these countries have taken control of Venezuela. The solution to Venezuela is no longer within Venezuela, is external to Venezuela within the actors that control it. So I believe in a year from now, President Trump is going to have to deal very seriously with the Venezuela crisis, and he's going to have to deal it on a global platform. He's going to have to deal with it by neutralizing Iran, Russia, and China and their activities on this side of the world. Basically a revival of the Monroe Doctrine, but even enhanced, but I would say that should be the Trump Doctrine.
Okay, Ariel, you close this out. A year from now, are the Europeans going to be supporting American policy on the nuke deal?
Well, if we invoke the snapback, they will. I hope they do. Speaking to what you did, the importance of neutralizing Iran is huge, and we can't do it alone. The maximum pressure campaign, there are limitations to it. Iran is, yes, the Iranian economy is suffering, but it's still relatively afloat. And what's actually interesting is that the coronavirus right now is hitting the upper echelons of Iranian leadership. And it's showing how fractured and how much dissidence there is within Iranian society and how much misinformation is actually spread by the Iranian government. So I think it's actually, Iran right now is experiencing both pressure from within and pressure from outside. But again, the maximum pressure campaign can only do so much. If we don't have our